Right now, the jihadist insurgency is trying to starve out a sovereign nation. The insurgents aren't burning the crops, they aren't poisoning the water, and they aren't killing the cattle. Instead, the al-Qaeda-linked terror organization known as JNIM is targeting the fuel, and after less than 2 months, the African nation of Mali is already on its knees. JNIM has been gaining ground for years, leaving a bloody trail of regime soldiers and Russian mercenaries in their wake. Mali, alongside the other nations of the embattled Sahel region, has struggled even to slow them down, let alone stop them. But now that JNIM has set its sights on Mali's energy supply, now that the insurgents have zeroed in on a critical vulnerability, they're building momentum faster than ever. Today, in the capital city of Bamako and the ancient metropolis of Timbuktu, Mali's fuel is running out, and when its reserves hit zero, expect all hell to break loose. The fuel must flow. The organization known as JNIM, short for Jama'at Nasr al-Islam wal Muslimin, has been thriving in the nation of Mali for nearly a decade. Estimated to comprise well over 5,000 fighters today, by even the conservative estimates, JNIM is a light and highly mobile asymmetric insurgency. The organization is present across much of the Sahel region, the part of Africa where blazing hot Sahara sands transition slowly into the tropical savanna. But in the nation of Mali, landlocked, sparsely populated and home to a bit over 23 million people, JNIM is at their very strongest. Today, JNIM is easily the largest and best-armed insurgency in the entire Sahel region, and it's on the short list of the most dangerous and the most capable non-state actors on Earth. Although it's technically an affiliate of al-Qaeda, it operates independently and chooses overwhelmingly to pursue its own goals, taking over villages and towns all across rural Mali, collecting taxes, extorting residents, and using those funds to accelerate their jihadist movement. And while JNIM currently lacks the strength to take the nation of Mali outright, the Malian government has not been able to wage war against JNIM effectively. The insurgents are at their strongest out in the countryside, where they can orchestrate ambushes, force battles on favorable ground, or blend into the landscape as they see fit. And when they're on the offensive, they frequently attack in massive swarms on motorbikes where their speed, mobility, and numbers are enough to overwhelm the forces that they're trying to fight. At times, JNIM attacks have led to the slaughter of dozens or even over 100 Malian soldiers at a single location, and for years they've been able to attack fortified military bases directly. In the late 2010s, while JNIM was still finding its feet, it was kept in check, at least somewhat, with the assistance of Western military advisors and airstrikes. But after Mali's current military regime assumed control of the nation in a coup, Western forces were booted out and Russian paramilitaries, specifically the notorious Wagner Group, were invited in. Wagner, like Malian soldiers themselves, proved unable to stem the tide of JNIM attacks, and in one instance, JNIM worked together with local Tuareg militants to slaughter somewhere between 50 and 80 Russian mercenaries during a sandstorm at the Battle of Tinsaatan. For that reason, it came as a bit of a surprise to global analysts when, on the 3rd of September, JNIM announced a change of strategy. In a video posted online, JNIM's head spokesman announced that effective immediately, it was going to impose and enforce a ban of all fuel imports into Mali. One major fuel transshipment company, Dar Transport, was warned directly that its trucks and the trucks of its subsidiaries were now subject to attack if they were seen on Malian roads. The mid-sized city of Kayes and the town of Nioro de Sahel were to be placed under targeted blockades where no non-residents could come in and no current residents could go out. Now, as a general rule, it's never a good thing when a powerful jihadist insurgency declares a ban on any type of goods entering a given country. But for JNIM to unilaterally blockade fuel imports to Mali, this was an especially salient threat. Mali has next to no petroleum harvesting capacity on its own soil and could only produce oil in negligible amounts using tiny proven reserves that haven't been worth the cost of extraction. Instead, Mali imports basically all of its energy supplies from abroad, from Senegal, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea, and Mauritania, with Senegal and Côte d'Ivoire accounting for almost 95% of all imports by themselves. Mali, of course, has strategic fuel reserves. It's not as if the nation is simply attempting to do it day by day and sustaining its national energy infrastructure. Unfortunately, however, those reserves are intended to compensate for regional shortages or isolated supply problems that could pop up over the course of ordinary business. If the entire nation were forced to rely on those reserves without rationing, then Mali would be able to keep the lights on for about 3 days. A nation under siege. Now, almost as soon as it had announced the blockade, JNIM's fighters leapt into action to prove their ability to enforce the new series of rules that it laid out. Now, the group started to capture fuel tankers on the road and set them alight. It started ambushing convoys where tankers were traveling in groups or under military escort. And if the group's fighters were greeted with resistance, they showed no hesitation in wiping out those troops who had attempted to oppose them. Because the vast majority of Mali's fuel enters the country from a small number of checkpoints in either the far south or the far west and then travels along predictable paths in areas where Janim wields influence, tankers have proved exceptionally difficult to hide and very easy for Janim to intercept. If a tanker is traveling unguarded, it takes no more than a couple of fighters on motorbikes or a makeshift roadblock to capture it, and even guarded convoys are at a disadvantage, moving through zones where the jihadists can leverage roadside bombs and attack from all directions. According to the Malian Petroleum Importers Association, over 100 tanker trucks were completely destroyed by Janim fighters during the month of September alone, although that number, in turn, is quite likely an undercount. In just a single attack on September the 14th, Janim fighters ambushed a convoy of several dozen tankers under military escort, defeated the military forces present, and set at least 40 of those tankers ablaze. Nor has Janim taken any interest in protecting the fuel that it captures once it's in possession of the tankers. In another country, dealing with another insurgency, national governments might be forced to buy back the fuel that's been stolen from them, with insurgents choosing to hold that fuel for ransom or even sell it off to the highest bidder. Janim, however, appears to have no interest in the revenues that it could gain by positioning itself as a fuel broker. The insurgents have neither the required manpower to protect large volumes of fuel nor the facilities to store it safely, and likely suspect they'd become vulnerable to government counterattack if they can't stay mobile. Moreover, Janim has plenty of other ways to make a profit without accepting nearly as much risk as the group's fighters have done by coming after Mali's fuel supply. The intent is very clearly to deprive Mali's government and its people and ensure that they can't obtain fuel under any circumstance. Truck drivers may be ransomed in the event that they're spared from summary execution, but those are living hostages. They're far easier to either transport or conceal than an entire fuel truck. While Janim hasn't gone out of its way to explain its objectives, it hasn't exactly been difficult for either the Malian government or international onlookers to piece together the basics of what they're trying to achieve. For one thing, a Malian military without fuel is a military that's on a much more level playing field against Janim. No heavy fighting vehicles, and perhaps not even armored jeeps and trucks at their disposal. For another, the blockade is just a way to drive a wedge between the Malian government and a range of other parties at once. Those potential disillusioned parties include the transshipment companies, who are usually responsible for managing the fuel that accounts for over 40% of Mali's entire volume of imported goods. They include the resource extraction companies, especially the foreign companies that require fuel to operate and trusted the Malian government to ensure stable and predictable deliveries, and perhaps most importantly of all, they include ordinary civilians, especially the middle-income and wealthy people living in Mali's cities who've been aware of the creeping Janim insurgency and will now feel its effects more than ever. Finally, by imposing such a complete blockade of fuel across Mali, the jihadists demonstrate their sheer offensive potency and the full extent of their power to wreak havoc upon an entire nation. As we mentioned previously, Janim is thought to comprise only around 5,000 to 6,000 fighters across the entire Sahel region, and almost certainly no more than 10,000. Mali's armed forces number 40,000, plus thousands of paramilitaries and at least several hundred fighters from Russia's Africa Corps, which recently replaced the Wagner Group. For Janim to be capable of a blockade on this scale, it validates the absolute worst fears that ordinary Malians might have about their government. Despite their massive numeric advantage, the nation's leaders and their military have simply been unable to intervene when a ragtag bunch of gunmen on motorbikes decided to lay down the law. As of the time of writing, it's been about 6 weeks since the blockade across Mali went into effect, and the repercussions have long since started to show. Residents report that most civilian gas stations are entirely empty. People who depend on their cars and motorbikes have been unable to work, study, or care for their families, and on the rare occasion that gasoline is delivered, panic often leads to fistfights and occasionally even shootouts. Fuel companies in the surrounding nations have started to refuse to send their own workers into Mali, instead hiring locals on a temporary basis to take fuel across the border and try and reach their destination for fear that the trucks could be interdicted and their drivers could be killed. The military does occasionally manage to retaliate, announcing a successful airstrike here or the killing of half a dozen insurgents there, but their victories are nowhere near enough to turn the tide. After weeks, when the government tried to keep things stable in the capital, using its reserves at the expense of the rest of the nation, they can no longer insulate the residents of Bamako from Janim's impact. Their power officials indicate that residents can expect only 6 hours of electricity a day, and that number is expected to drop again in the coming weeks. Right now, there's still enough carefully rationed fuel to ensure that the country doesn't shut down completely, and a delivery of 300 fully loaded fuel tankers traveling in a convoy under heavy guard on the 7th of October seems to have bought Mali a bit more time. But the collapse is coming sooner than later, and although Mali went so far as to try and negotiate directly with Djinim to meet its conditions, those negotiations now appear to have collapsed. Just a quick pause to share something with you that we are rather excited about over here. No, we're not asking for donations to fund our counter lawsuit against Somalia yet. Also, probably won't be necessary. Instead, we want to tell you how WarFronts has expanded into a brand new medium. Fronts.co. It's a website. It's not a .com because that was unavailable, and even if available, really expensive. This was expensive enough. So, after launching our newsletter earlier this year, we realized there is an appetite out there for our brand of analysis in the written form. So, we got in touch with some experts, including actual award-winning journalists who agreed to write for us. I know. They did, though. They did. WarFronts grew so fast. And now we're showing you the results. Fronts.co is our subscriber-only website featuring longer-form, in-depth articles on aspects of defense and geopolitics that we feel are getting overlooked. The inner mechanics of Russia's sanctions evasion, how maths can make you a better warfighter. Yes, really. And if you want serious analysis for dangerous times, this Fronts.co, that site, is the place to be. Beyond that, it's also going to be the home of exclusive videos. Twice a week, we'll be publishing bonus WarFronts episodes covering everything we do best, like assessing whether Poland or Russia would win were war to break out tomorrow. All of this is just $5 a month or $50 a year. That's fronts.co, not .com, and nothing on WarFronts is changing. All of the content you love remains here as ever. It's all just extra. And now back to today's video. Endgame. Now, at this point in Djinim's blockade, it is possible to deny the success that the terrorist organization has achieved thus far. Mali isn't broken yet, but it's on the path for its fuel stores to completely run out, and simply expecting that the government can orchestrate more fuel convoys of a similar size to the last one is not a winning bet. Djinim's greatest strength has always been its ability to adapt to changing circumstances, and the group is almost certain to adapt again if convoys of hundreds of tankers at once become a recurring problem. Besides that, any other option at Mali's disposal to turn this situation around would require Mali to be a far more competent and formidable counterinsurgent force than it's demonstrated thus far. But there's still an open question around Djinim's blockade, and that's the issue of the terrorists' endgame. While Djinim has issued a handful of demands in exchange for a lifting of the blockade, those demands simply don't seem to be the sort of thing that would justify Djinim going to the lengths that it has. The group is demanding things like a prisoner exchange, or a new rule that would mandate women to wear veils on buses, the sort of thing that Djinim could probably extract as a concession by, say, taking a few important hostages or besieging a vulnerable military base. If that was all Djinim wanted to achieve, then blockading fuel imports into the entire nation for more than a month straight would be an act of massive overkill. Even the rumors about Djinim's initial reason to attempt a blockade, pushing back against fuel restrictions in rural areas that deprive Djinim, like Djinim is depriving the government now, still don't tell the full story. But although we, here at WarFronts, don't exactly have Djinim's leaders on speed dial to ask them ourselves, we can draw on the observations of regional experts who suspect they've identified the higher objectives beyond the blockade. In particular, we're going to spotlight three: to raise domestic disillusionment with Mali's government, to sabotage or undermine security across the wider Sahel, and to pressure the foreign companies and governments that help to prop up Mali's military regime. On the question of disillusionment, Djinim clearly understands the principle that's guided asymmetric insurgencies all across the globe. The less that ordinary people believe in their government, the more likely they are to believe in you. Although Djinim can be quite brutal in the areas it controls, it's not uniformly disliked across Mali. Some communities align with Djinim for religious reasons, believing in the same hardline ideology that they work to spread. Others see membership in the group as a way out of poverty. Sometimes it can be the only way for them to get out of poverty. Still, others may not believe in Djinim's ideology, but they are happy to see somebody pushing back against Mali's military government and the foreigners that are working to exploit the country's mineral wealth. Bamako has hardly endeared itself to ordinary people recently, formally dissolving all political parties this past May and expanding crackdowns against the political opposition, the media, and ordinary protesters. And in some places, even where Janim is regarded as a threat, it's also regarded as the lesser of two evils. After years absorbing all the training and battlefield ideology of Russia's Wagner Group, Mali's government forces have become acclimatized to all manner of wartime atrocities, especially in the rural areas, and quite often targeting civilians. All those factors, in combination, were already pushing a growing number of Malians to consider aligning with Janim or even joining the group voluntarily. Now, with critical fuel supplies cut off, life across Mali is going to get harder. Circumstances for ordinary people are going to grow more dire, and the nation's government is likely to continue to prove two things simultaneously. Number one, they'll prove that they simply are not competent enough to liberate Mali from a group that is thoroughly outfoxed. And number two, they'll prove that when they do occasionally get their hands on some fuel, that fuel will be sent to the capital, the military, or foreign industry, or being intentionally withheld from Mali's own people. Whenever Janim can drive that message home and erode public faith in Bamako, it's likely to see its own fortunes rise. And then there's the rest of the Sahel, where Janim is still very active. In the neighboring nation of Burkina Faso, where things have been mostly quiet during the summer months while Janim focused on Mali, the insurgents have now returned with a vengeance. On the 9th of October, Janim launched 2 attacks along a critical road to Burkina Faso's capital. In one of those attacks, 11 people were killed and 40 injured. In the other, Janim ambushed a Burkinabe military convoy where at a minimum no fewer than 90 soldiers were massacred. Local estimates suggest a true death toll as high as 130. In past years, Janim has launched attacks all across Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, as well as nearby Benin, and they're known to be expanding their presence into Ghana, Togo, and Côte d'Ivoire. In all those nations, Janim grows more dangerous and more effective if it can leverage nearby territory that it controls completely in a place like Mali. By diminishing the Malian government's capacity to fight back and consolidating control over rural areas by forcing the government to focus on a crisis elsewhere, Janim has given itself a secure launchpad to carry out attacks all across the region. In similar cases across modern history, this is where insurgent groups really start to gain traction, whether it's al-Qaeda setting up training camps in Central Asia, the Islamic State taking over part of Iraq and Syria, Boko Haram locking down territory in Nigeria, or any number of other instances worldwide. Finally, a severe and enduring disruption to Mali's fuel imports would allow Janim to ratchet up the pressure against foreign companies who oversee mining and other resource extraction deals across Mali's territory. Those operations are run by Chinese nationals, Russian nationals, Indian nationals, investors from the Gulf states of the Arab world, investors from elsewhere in Africa, and, judging by recent reporting, potentially a swell of new investment from the United States. Those operations are responsible for a large proportion of the income that props up Mali's government as Bamako ships away its resources in exchange for licensing deals and to cut the profits. In addition to funding the regime, those foreign investments stabilize the regime, both because all countries involved want to ensure that their profits and supply lines are secure, and because some countries like Russia send large amounts of personnel to physically ensure that those operations are not threatened. But those operations need fuel if they're going to persist. They've got to keep the lights on, they've got to operate equipment, and their people need to be able to move around both the immediate region and the rest of the country. That cannot happen if fuel tankers can't move across Mali as expected, and before very much longer, the results will start to show. Mining operations will have to begin slowing down, and in many cases could even have to pause completely. Foreign workers will grow more isolated, while mining harvests will be far harder to move and thus far harder to sell or send away for processing. The breakdown has already started, as shown by an incident in early October, when Mali prohibited around 70 fuel trucks from traveling to a lucrative rural gold mine run by a Canadian company, Allied Gold, where fuel was rapidly running out. Janim is acutely aware of the interplay between these foreign operations and the security of the regime in Bamako, and over the years, Janim has regularly threatened mines, kidnapped or killed foreign workers, and otherwise tried to make it impossible for these groups to justify staying in Mali. But never before has Janim been able to pose this acute of a threat to foreign industry. Right now, the group has a real chance of making these kinds of operations untenable in Mali if it could just keep up the pressure, cut off the flow of resources and profits, and break these foreign partners' faith in the Malian government. Unfortunately, the grand push and pull between Janim and Mali's leaders is all but guaranteed to harm the people caught in the middle, the millions upon millions of Malians who depend on fuel in order to survive. Depending on where this crisis goes next, Janim's actions could prompt a swell of popular discontent against the government of Bamako, potentially bringing larger social upheaval, or, if recent events across the globe are any indication, maybe even regime change. But the more likely option, at least for now, is that the people caught between a relentless jihadist insurgency and a repressive but largely impotent military regime are going to suffer the consequences for as long as this siege continues. Thank you for watching.